Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Bud Bazelak, the Provost and Executive Vice President at Case Western Reserve University. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the 2012 Inamori Ethics Prize Academic Symposium. Joining me on stage today are Shannon French, Director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence, David Suzuki, the recipient of the 2012 Inamori Ethics Prize, and our distinguished panelists, David Orr and Jeremy Bendekiemer. We had previously announced that Paul Hawken would participate in this academic symposium. Unfortunately, a family emergency has prevented him from being with us today. Please join me in officially welcoming our panelists. Today we mark the 5th anniversary of the Inamori Ethics Prize. We are here because of the vision and generosity of Dr. Kazuo Inamori and the Inamori Foundation, whose generous endowment created the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence here at Case Western Reserve University and the annual Inamori Ethics Prize. We are delighted that Dr. Inamori could travel from Kyoto, Japan to join us this afternoon. Traveling from Japan with Dr. Inamori are key representatives from the Inamori Foundation and the Kyocera Corporation. We are very grateful to have you all here. We are all very grateful to have you here to share this academic symposium with us. I would also like to acknowledge our title sponsor, the Callahan Foundation, along with all of our generous sponsors and community partners. In your program, you can find a complete list of these benefactors. Their investment in the Inamori Ethics Prize Ceremony and Center is a tribute to our shared values and speaks to the importance of ethical leadership in our society. In addition, we are delighted to have with us today students from some local high schools, including Montessori High School, Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, Laurel, and others, as well as members of our own Global Ethical Leadership Society called GELS. Thank you for being here as part of today's events. This symposium will be a panel discussion to explore ethical issues related to the work of this year's Inamori Ethics Prize recipient, Dr. David Suzuki. Let me introduce our panelists to you, beginning with our 2012 Inamori Ethics Prize honoree. Environmentalist David Suzuki is a global leader on issues of sustainable ecology and climate justice. Esteemed around the world for his radio and television programs, documentaries, and publications, Suzuki is a powerful voice for biodiversity, future generations, and the planet. A celebrated academic, Dr. Suzuki earned his PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago. He worked for over 40 years as a professor in genetics and is now professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia's Sustainable Research Development Institute. He has written over 300 popular articles and 40 books, including The Sacred Balance, Rediscovering Our Place in Nature, and Everything Under the Sun, Toward a Brighter Future on a Small Blue Planet. Dr. Suzuki is an acclaimed host, director, and producer of over 24 series and documentaries about sustainability. Since 1979, Suzuki has hosted The Nature of Things, a CBS television series broadcast in nearly 50 countries. Suzuki's most recent film, Force of Nature, won the People's Choice Documentary Award at the 2010 Toronto International Film Festival. In 1990, Suzuki co-founded the David Suzuki Foundation, whose main missions are transforming the economy, protecting the climate, reconnecting with nature, and building communities of individuals who live healthier, more fulfilled, and just lives. Joining Dr. Suzuki on our panel today is Dr. David Orr, who is the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics at Oberlin College, and also a James Marsh Professor at the University of Vermont. Professor Orr has received 5 honorary degrees and numerous other awards, a distinguished scholar, teacher, writer, speaker, and entrepreneur, specializing in environmental politics, environmental education, campus greening, green building, ecological design, and climate change. His many published works include the classics Ecological Literacy and Earth in Mind. He organized the first conference exploring the effects of climate change on the banking industry and is crafting a 100 Days Climate Action Plan for the Obama administration. Rounding out our panel is our own expert on environmental ethics, Dr. Jeremy Bendekiemer. Dr. Bendekiemer is the Elmer G. Beamer Hubert H. Schneider Professor in Ethics in our Philosophy Department here at Case Western Reserve University. Jeremy joined our faculty to promote ethics throughout the undergraduate curriculum after teaching at Yale, the University of Chicago, Colorado College, American University at Sharjah, and Lemoyne College. His many published works explore issues ranging from human rights and civics to philosophy of education to environmental philosophy and environmental ethics. Two of his recent books include The Ecological Life, Discovering Citizenship and a Sense of Humanity, and the co-authored Ethical Adaptation to Climate Change, Human Virtues of the Future. We are pleased that you all have decided to join us today and hope you'll take this opportunity to listen and engage our panelists on issues of environmental ethics that, of course, concern us all. At this time, I turn the program over to Dr. Shannon E. French, the Inamori Professor in Ethics, who will moderate today's panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Provost Baselick. Before we begin our conversation, I have a personal message to share with you from another deeply committed environmentalist who very much wished to be here today but was unable to join us, Mr. Bill McKibben. I'm now reading his message that he shared with us. I am so sorry not to be able to be there in person with you, but I want to say such congratulations, David, on this prize and on so many other accomplishments. It's a month where we mark the 50th anniversary of the publication of Silent Spring, a good month for thinking about people who have led us farthest and with the most power, passion, and precision in a very long time. With our current crop of leaders, many of them on the stage with you today, there is just been no one more important in helping the world understand what is going on and in leading the way out of it. I am so grateful for your work and so eager to see you again before long. Congratulations, Bill McKibben. To begin our conversation, David Suzuki, you recently released a depressingly titled op-ed piece that was called The Fundamental Failure of Environmentalism. Has the environmentalist movement failed? In what sense?
Well, this is not to denigrate in any way the history of the environmental movement. When Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring, there wasn't a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. That book began the movement that put the environment on the map. And you think of the enormous growth in only 10 years. The first global conference on the environment in 1972 was held in Stockholm. At that time, the United Nations Environment Program was set up. We saw the enormous growth in interest, so that laws have been passed in many countries to protect air and water, limitations on pollution, protection of endangered species, and millions of hectares of land around the world have been saved as parks or reserves. So this is not to deny the important role that the environmental movement has played, but I think that we failed really to grapple with the underlying root cause of the destructive path that we're on. We fought against dams, mega dams. We fought against dangers of drilling for oil offshore. We fought against destruction of forests. But we never focused our message on the reason why we oppose such development, that we had to come to some kind of balance with the natural world that sustains us, to see ourselves as a part of a much bigger system rather than being the species in charge to be able to take it all over and manage it for our own purposes. So this is often referred to as a paradigm shift. We really need to see ourselves in a different way, and we didn't succeed in that.
Jeremy, would you care to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, this came up in the radio show this morning, so apologies if this is a second time around. I was struck by how the very word environment involves this problem. The environment means the world around us. That's what it means in Latin, or from Latin. In German, Umwelt, it means the world surrounding us. So there's a picture there already of a duality. Right? We're separate from the environment like a disembodied mind, and the question is, how do we relate to it? So, I mean, at some fundamental level, we're not even thinking of our home Earth in the right way. We think of it already as something separate from us. So I do agree with that point.
Another aspect,
Yeah.
sorry, David, but another aspect is that we think of environmentalism as, or the environmental movement as something special, so that we celebrate if there's a Green Party. And I'm saying, what does it mean to have a Green Party when in Canada, until last year, we never had a Green Party in office in Parliament? So when there was a debate, a public debate, only the leaders of political parties in Ottawa were allowed to debate. So the Green Party leader wasn't there. And all of the journalists acted as if, oh, well, the Greens aren't here, so we don't have to talk about the environment. So we've got to get away from the idea that the environment is somehow a political football.
Or a separate issue as opposed to everyone's
Yes.
issue. We're all on the planet. David, please go ahead.
Humans are slow learners. Case notwithstanding, you know, Jesus, Moses, Buddha, Confucius, and so forth lived thousands of years ago, and we're still trying to figure out what they meant and what that means for how we live. And if you date the environmental movement from 1962 or whatever, the Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, that's a short period of time. And we're still, I agree with David, I think we're still trying to mull this over. The problem we have is the timing. There's this remorseless working of big numbers. Carbon in the atmosphere and heat trapping gases don't care a bit about any of us. They just do their work. And we put them up there, and we've set in motion this, these effects that will occur. And if somebody, we were just saying before, if somebody says you don't believe in climate change, it's the wrong word. Nobody says you don't believe in the laws of gravity. And if they do, you know, there's a simple test for that. Come to the top of the building, let's check it out. You know, you jump first. But we're still trying to mull this over. And one other comment here, I think that the environmental movement as a phrase, in some ways, it's too big a phrase. If I break it up into the component parts, the green building movement is doing extremely well. My friend Gene Matthews here at CASE has helped to spearhead the movement here and elsewhere. Gene, was there anything else you wanted me to say? But the green building movement is doing extremely well. Jeremy's part of the environmental philosophy movement is doing extremely well. David Suzuki has been a leader for years in getting us to think through all the ramifications of this. So in some ways, there are parts of this movement that are doing extremely well. But I agree with David's overall point that we've got a long way to go.
Well, now let me ask, what do you say to the optimistic person who says, well, yes, I recognize the threat and the danger, but technology will save us. There will be some amazing innovation that will come up, and they will figure out how to change the carbon or suck it out of the air or something, and we'll all be fine. We just need to, you know, let that happen.
The problem with these technologies, powerful as they are, is that we don't know enough to recognize what the bigger implications are within the biosphere. So we opt for the immediate benefit of a new technology. For example, DDT. Great, it kills bugs. Lots of studies done in labs and in growth chambers and so on, and you spray it on an insect in a plant, and plant flourishes, the insect dies. Oh, this is great. But the lab is not the real world. In the real world, it rains, the wind blows, water flows, and you spray to kill insects on a field, and you end up affecting fish and birds and human beings. I would just want to remind you that we didn't know that when you spray at very low concentrations in parts per million, that small organisms then absorb that, they're not killed by it, and at each level up the food chain you concentrate it, so by the time you get to the fatty tissue in the shell glands of birds and in the breasts of women, you've concentrated DDT hundreds of thousands of times. We didn't know about the phenomenon of biomagnification until eagles began to disappear, and scientists tracked it down and discovered this. And this happens over and over again. CFCs, no one knew that CFCs would waft up into the upper atmosphere where chlorine-free radicals would be cleaved by ultraviolet light and break down ozone. I didn't even know there was an ozone layer up there when scientists began to say CFCs are destroying the ozone layer. When nuclear bombs are dropped on Japan, We didn't even know there was a thing called radioactive fallout that was found in bikinis. So the idea now that we've created a problem with climate change, but we'll geoengineer the planet in order to avoid the problem is madness. One of the things that in Canada we're trying to do with excessive carbon is, we'll just capture it and put it back in the ground.
Carbon sequestration.
Carbon sequestration. We've invested billions of dollars in this. But, up until a few years ago, it was assumed that life stopped at bedrock, that it went down a few yards and then it was sterile from that point on. And then they kept getting drills that were going further and further down and contaminated with bacteria. Now we know there are bacteria that exist up to 7 miles underground. These creatures are so different from any life forms we know on Earth, on the surface. We have to create new phyla to define them. So they're very bizarre. They've been down there for millions and millions of years, and it's now estimated the weight of protoplasm underground is greater than the weight of protoplasm above ground, more than all of the trees and the birds and the whale. That's because it goes down 7 miles. So we have no idea what those life forms are doing down there. Are they involved in heat transfer, water movement, nutrient flow? We don't know anything about that. And we're now going to pump millions of tons of carbon into the ground. I just think it's madness.
So we can't fix a system, we don't know how it works.
We don't, exactly.
Yeah. You wanted to jump in.
Well, the word in your question here, the word optimism appears, and since 1954, I've been a Cleveland Indians fan. And
Good man.
the problem here is this is if you're optimistic in a way because of what David has just said, you don't know enough. If you're in despair, that's a sin. You don't want to go there. And in between those two poles, there's something called hope. And the only legitimate position for us now is to be hopeful. And that is to believe you can change the odds that the optimist relies on. But hope is, in this case, it's a verb with its sleeves rolled up. It means if you're hopeful, you can't, as an optimist can, or somebody in despair, put your feet up on the table and have another beer or whatever you drink, and you don't have to do anything. But if you're hopeful, you have to do something. You have to act. And I'm still a Cleveland Indians fan. It's been a long year.
If I could add to
Please.
that, this is not, hope is not something just a Pollyanna-ish thing. I think it's what we cling to in order to empower us to carry on. Many of our colleagues are now saying it's too late, that we've passed too many tipping points, that we can't reverse or restore things. And I've followed their papers and I agree with what they say, but hope is what you have to cling to if we can pull back and give nature a chance. And my hope is based on the fact we don't know enough to say it's too late. And let me give you an example of what can surprise us. The most prized species of salmon in the world is called a sockeye salmon. It's got that bright red flesh. And the largest run of sockeye salmon in the world is in the Fraser River in British Columbia. Now, we've traditionally, after white people arrived in BC, populations of salmon dropped, but a 30 to 35 million run of sockeye salmon was a good run. 3 years ago, we got just over 1 million sockeye salmon. And I said to my wife, that's it. It's just not enough to sustain that species. 1 year later, we got the biggest run of sockeye salmon in 100 years. Now, that doesn't prove how stupid I am, because nobody knows what happened. But nature shocked us. And my hope rests on the fact we don't know enough to know whether or not nature has more surprises. But if we can give her a chance, I think all kinds of things are still possible.
Would you care to comment on hope, Jeremy?
I'd like to go back to the techno-optimism, but I mean, that is a kind of Hail Mary pass hope, right? That's different than if you earn your hope by conscientiously doing what you know you're supposed to do, and you think, I need hope to go on to be able to do this. I mean, the thing that strikes me about the techno-optimistic line is that it seems it seems morally corrupt to me, and for this reason. If, say, let's say my child wants to go into some area of the woods where there's recently been a landslide, and the question is about whether or not it's possible for engineers to get in there and to rebuttress the cliff. I don't send my child out into the woods expecting that there's a possibility that the engineers who look like they might be able to do this will just happen to get around to do this, let's say, by the end of the summer, right? I need a reasonable expectation. And the techno-optimism you're talking about it's not concrete yet. So what you'd really expect someone to say who isn't corrupt mentally would be to say, look, I really hope the singularity is coming, the moment where nanotechnology, genetic technology, biotechnology, and information technology give us an entirely new, different fabric of being. But right now, here are the real risks that we're facing. Here are the real limitations we have. And here are the kinds of things that need to be in place if we're going to be responsible about this. And if the optimism comes to pass, great. But in the meantime, I have to be responsible for the risk that could happen. So the entire line of reasoning just seems morally corrupt to me. It doesn't seem conscientious. I know that sounds, it sounds absolute to say that, but I really do think when you look at ordinary people who are conscientious, that isn't the way they think about things that are really serious coming down the pipeline.
And your example with your own child, you would never stake your own child's safety on this chance.
Not at all.
You wanted to jump in again. Yeah.
Well, I agree with that, and I think there's an issue here of how we handle these questions, and there are only so many options. One is you can go deep into denial, and we know people can go into denial, and countries can go into denial. We just don't want to see what's right in front of us. Staying out of denial, if you want to deal with this, then you have to confront hard possibilities. And that's tough for us as humans. We like optimistic people. In a way, the U.S. culture, it's hard for us to reckon with anything that might have a tragic outcome. It's easier in, say, Europe and in the Far East, where you have ruins that are testimony to human fallibility. We are a more ignorant species than we are smart, for all the reasons that David has said so well. And so it's how do we handle tragic possibilities? E.F. Schumacher, the great British economist, at the end of one of his books, he said, if you pose the question, can humans survive? And the answer comes back no, well then it's eat, drink, and be merry. If the answer comes back yes, then it leads to complacency. His advice was better not even to pose the question, just get down to what's in front of you and what you can do here and now. And I think there's some real virtue in that.
I keep thinking of the mythology that when they opened Pandora's box, all these terrible vices came out, but at the bottom of the box was hope. But you still had to deal with all the vices, and the hope was just to give you the strength to address them one by one, and again, not to be complacent. And I think you've all echoed that theme. I want to bring out a slightly different point. It's certainly related to everything we've been discussing. Jeremy, in your book, The Ecological Life, you discuss what it means to be human, and you stress the importance of relatedness. And also in Ethical Adaptation to Climate Change, you talk about the importance of recognizing our ethical obligations to future generations. So I was thinking about that, and I'm wondering, what is the obstacle here? Why is it difficult for people to take future generations into consideration in a meaningful way? And I think the work of all three of you relates to this. Certainly, Dr. Suzuki, you've talked about the importance of intergenerational work in this area. And I wonder if you could all comment on this aspect of the issue.
Please. Well, I think that traditionally in Canada, the Aboriginal people speak of 7 generations. So that when decisions were made by the tribes, major decisions, they would talk about 7 generations of their ancestors, remembering the past, and 7 generations into the future and what the repercussions might be. That's long-term thinking. We've become a very impatient animal. We want everything now. And we don't, from the political standpoint, children don't vote. So it's not because politicians are evil or stupid, but the nature of their game is when you're elected, your primary concern is getting reelected, and that's to appeal to those people who are going to vote. Young people don't. I mean, for that matter, can you imagine a politician in the United States saying, well, I want to commit $10 billion to climate reduction because of future generations? I mean, they'd be laughed out of the room because they aren't even here. And the economic system itself is actually, in looking at long-term potential costs, discounts the impact of what we do now on future generations, so that we kind of write them off, or we consider them less, our burdens left to them are less. It's all goes against the rights of future generations. So I'm trying to come up with legal means of holding our so-called leaders to account. I attended the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, the largest gathering of heads of state ever in human history. I went back again this year on the 20th anniversary. None of the leaders that were there in 1992 were there 20 years later. So they can sign all kinds of documents they want. They don't have to worry about whether you follow through with it. We've got to hold them to account. Now, there is a group in Germany that's trying to look at a legal means of holding people for criminal intergenerational activity, which is an interesting approach. For me, I think there's a legal category called willful blindness. If you're in an area and you deliberately avoid being informed of something you should in your role, you can be sued for that. And I certainly think that politicians ought to be held accountable for their willful blindness.
Jeremy, or well. Jeremy.
No, I mean, I agree with the basic point, right? Whether or not we can be oriented toward the future morally depends on our institutional structure, depends on our political systems and the way that they shape our economy. There is some evidence anthropologically that we have various kinds of short-term decision biases. There is a sense in which we have evolved to be somewhat near-term thinkers. But the other amazing thing about human beings is we're political animals, right? We're capable of complex organization and of extending our minds beyond our communities through technology to vastly counteract our limitations. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be very fancy, right? A 7th generation matriarch is a 1,000-year-old thing up in upstate New York in the Onondaga Nation. You know, so yeah, this is a question of political organization. And so all I would add to what David said is that, I mean, I think, first of all, politically, I do not understand how future children are not on the national political agenda in my country, which is this country. I mean, this boggles my mind. We're supposed to be concerned with family values, and we're not talking about putting our junk onto future kids. And it's not just junk, really. It's incapacitating them horribly, and usually the most powerful, right? The problem with what I call presentism, like racism. Presentism is caring more about yourself than about the equal and rightful demands of the future, more about your own generation than the future. The problem with presentism is it's a magnifier. It magnifies the effects on all the other forms of isms, right? Because usually the people who are subject to racism or sexism in particular are vulnerable. Yeah. But presentism magnifies the situation so that in the future, those vulnerable people who don't have access to power, resources, and so on, are more likely to get hurt as a result of what we're doing. So the first thing I would say, and then I'll just end it so David can talk, is that this just has to be on the national political agenda. And part of it should be an attempt to put, not just in law, but in institutions, some way of hearing the voice or giving place to the voice of the future. I don't mean this in a fantastic way. I mean it has to be done through some thinking of rights and legality and internalization of economic burdens.
That you could, for example, bring a suit saying you have harmed future generations.
Yeah. And there's something like the State Department, where there's some institution, boom, that is tasked with doing that.
That has that focus. Yeah. Yes, David Orr.
I don't have a lot to add to this. I mean, David Suzuki's a great spokesperson for future generations. Jeremy's one of the leading scholarly voices on this, but my training was in political science, and if you read the U.S. Constitution, the word posterity only appears one time, and it's in the preamble. And there's no case law. Now, if you go back, that was about 7 generations ago. And so if you go back those 7 generations, you ask, what would they have us do for the next 7 generations from our time going forward? They had no idea of what we can do to the planet, that we could unravel the biosphere in a way that David's described so eloquently, with the implications that Jeremy has explained so clearly. So now we know that our behavior can deprive future generations of life and liberty and property without due process. And that is a violation of the 5th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the 14th Amendment. And so now we need to think of a legal movement, and I totally agree with my colleagues on the panel that this needs to be an issue morally driven of law. And then the perplexities begin then. You say, okay, what happens with, how do you represent the rights of future generations? Well, in the case of, let's say, brain-damaged people or people who are otherwise disabled, you appoint a court custodian, some representative that represents their interests as best they could be known. And so this is not an impossibility. It is a complicated thing. The last thing I would say is this. We hear a lot about, aside from original intent of the U.S. Constitution, we hear a lot about the right to life. And if we take the right to life seriously, it isn't just about fetuses, whatever your opinion on abortion, it isn't just about that. It's about the people who live now. It's about the people and all the web of life that will exist in the future. And in a philosophy, you can't pick and choose. Philosophies are not cafeterias. You pick a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and ignore the rest. You have to take the whole thing. And if life really is the orienting principle, then you have to take it seriously across the full range. That includes all life now, all life that could exist if we don't deprive it of its existence and property and freedom to live.
I'd like to stick with you for a moment, David Orr. You've been quoted as saying, sustainable development cannot happen in classrooms. It has to happen in the streets. And I was wondering, in what ways can we implement sustainable practices in urban communities without backlash or unintended ill effects? Can you comment on that?
Well, first is I didn't mean it when I said it. No, I think that I'm an educator. I teach at Oberlin College. And I think the issue for us is that we're visual creatures. We believe what we can see, touch, feel, experience. And we live in this realm of, people like us talk about sustainability and so forth, and that's an abstraction. And abstractions don't move people. They move people like us, maybe, ideologues and professors, but they really don't move the world very far. And so what you're doing here, and my colleague and friend David Beach and so forth around Cleveland, it is to begin to make these ideas real so it becomes a Main Street reality. And just very quickly, in Oberlin, we're trying to take a model in a city of 10,000. We're 35 miles from downtown Cleveland. Trying to take our assets as a community of 10,000 and bundle that together so that what we're calling the Oberlin Project includes food, law, policy, green building, green development, economic renewal, and so forth, and put them together into a package where the parts reinforce the whole thing. We've never done that before. That's never happened in the United States before. But it ought to begin to happen in little places like Oberlin, and we take it viral throughout this particular region. There's a different economy trying to be born here. Many of you in the room are working seriously on this as educators and as city people and so forth. But this is where education becomes real, because mostly what we do, and back to the word hope, to embody hope and to make, let's say, the Cleveland metropolitan area or Northeast Ohio a laboratory of here's what you can do. When the chips were down and this, quote, Rust Belt region began to go through a renaissance and did it sustainably, that's hopeful. And that begins to attract more people to begin to do that elsewhere. So Shannon, the point here for me is, as an educator, is to take these ideas and give them Main Street reality. You can talk about renewable energy, but the wind power and the photovoltaic arrays that you're involved with here, that begins to be hope. People can see that and say, yeah, now I understand that. And begin to build green jobs and green employment. That's something people can begin to get their minds around at a scale that is comprehensible.
From the abstract to the concrete.
Abstract to concrete, you bet.
Would either of you like to comment on this further?
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question, but I became involved in environmental issues after Rachel Carson's book. And basically we were fighting against things, fighting this, fighting a dam, fighting the destruction of a forest, fighting pollution of the ocean. And
Such a conservationist movement in some ways too, trying to preserve what was being destroyed.
Of course,
Yeah.
but what I feel now is that we still come together and we're fighting. We can't afford to fight because where you win, there's always a loser. And we can't afford to have losers anymore. I've been in British Columbia, where I live, two of the big issues are fisheries and forests. And we've had all of these battles, and now we're trying to come together at a round table where all of the stakeholders, I hate that word, but the people with different vested interests come together and try to work something out. But what happens is that people come in and I'm a commercial fisherman and I'm going to fight for my share. I'm an Aboriginal and this is my tradition. And you end up coming out with what is a compromise that's not really dealing with the issue of genuine sustainability. So what I ask is, can we come together and throw out our vested interests and start from a platform of what we agree? Ah. Because if we don't start with what we agree, then we're just arguing for our own special stakes. And so my position is this: can we not all agree that the absolute most fundamental need is air? The minute we were born, we had to take a breath of air. And from that point on, 15 to 40 times a minute until the last breath before we die. So surely our highest priority should be protecting air. And that means when someone wants to dump something into it, you go, wait a minute now, that's the life-giving substance that maintains all terrestrial creatures. That's sacred. I feel you deal with it in a different way. If you don't have water for more than a few days, you're dead. If you have polluted water, you're sick. So surely water, everybody has to agree, water is a fundamental need that we have to treat in a special way. And then we get all of our food, every bit of our food was once alive. Most of it was grown in the soil. So soil, every bit of the energy in our bodies is sunlight fixed by photosynthesis. So photosynthesis isn't can we not construct a platform of our most basic needs? Start biologically, socially, and spiritually, and then ask, how do we make a living? Or how do we live?
Yeah. We have some violent agreement going on. Yes.
I agree with that. And the perplexity, the difficulty is, how do you take those ideas, I think this is one for our whole generation, and then render that into an economy that works?
Right.
And how we provision ourselves with food, energy, water, livelihood, healthcare, all of these things, and celebration in a way that we don't contaminate the fundamentals of life that David described so well. And I think for our generation, and let me just leave this as a question, and for you young people in the audience, the most important task you can have is, how do we begin to take all of the things that we want, clean air, clean water, and so forth, and begin to build an economy around that, and an economy maybe small e hitched to a society capital S. And so this seems to me to be the challenge of our time. How do we make this work? Two political conventions. Economic growth is a huge item for both parties. And the question is, how do you grow the economy more? And I think the question for us is not one of growth, but one of quality. And how do you ensure fair distribution of what there is, provide for long-term sustainability for future generations? But I don't want to gloss over this point. I think this is the challenge. That's the heart of the challenge ahead of us.
Jeremy, I'd like you to comment, but before you do, I want to give a heads up. In just a moment, I'm going to open the floor to questions from any of you. You will notice in the aisles we have microphones set up. I'm afraid because of the taping, we can only take your question if you will proceed to the microphone, because otherwise the audio will be, we won't be able to hear it. So if you have a question in mind and would like to actually start to line up at the microphones, I'll be doing that in just a moment. Jeremy, would you care to comment on this train of thought?
Well, there's so much to say. I think it's so eloquently said. I'd rather hear what the floor has to say, okay. and I'll weave something in. The only thing briefly I'd say is that David's initial comment, David Orr's initial comment. Look, you're talking about, sustainability is such an abstract word. You're talking about not just a new set of habits, but a new experience of tinkering and re-exploring what it is to be practical. So I just think the very nature of it requires that you think of education as a kind of externship, as a kind of lab, as a kind of communally embedded experiment. And so that means breaking the, in theater you talk about breaking the fourth wall. Yeah. Well, you need to break the walls of the classroom for that. So, I mean, I don't want to say too much more because I don't think it's as impassioned as what was just said, but that's the logical implication of it. The university needs to be rethought around these interdisciplinary problems that are fundamentally practical and political. And so it needs to get, any kind of school needs to get the students out in the community and also tinkering and working with stuff so that it's possible to see what a different kind of life is like and what a political life is like. So yeah, I agree with these points.
Well, it looks like we do have folks lined up, so I'm going to start over here, and if you could please, if you don't mind stating your name and then your question, and then if you have a particular panelist that you'd like to direct it to, or if you'd just like the panel in general to respond.
Thanks. I'm Joe Conan from Cleveland. I was interested in your comments, any of you, on the net effect of religion on the future of this whole movement that you're talking about in our future. It seems on the one hand we have some religious people who are very impassioned about the future of the planet. I think on the other hand, we see religion sometimes buttressing kind of a blindness that maybe you were talking about earlier.
Who would like to take that? Now.
Thanks for the question. I think, if you ask what the word environment implies, bringing a wholeness and so forth, and the root for the word religion means to bind together. And so I think you can make a very good case out that if you're concerned about wholeness or religion, wholeness, whole, holy, there's more than an etymological similarity here. There's the attempt to try to build a civilization where the parts do, in fact, hang together in a way that's fair and decent and just and honors the sacredness of the creation, whatever your denominational religious affiliation might be. So, Joe, I think thanks for the question. I think that's a really good question.
Would either of you like to comment further on religion and the environment?
I'm an atheist. I don't have much comment about religion, I'm afraid, but
Jeremy,
I'll go with David.
Do you have anything to say on this topic?
Just two brief things. The one is that, the core of piety, or if you don't call it piety, you may call it, whatever that relation is that binds you to the beings of your religion, or the being of your religion, or the nothingness of your religion, is a form of devotion. Right? It engages a capacity inside the human being to be more than cynical, and to be willing to give for something that's not just your egotistical self. So to the extent that religion really speaks thoughtfully to that, I think it has a very intimate connection with being able of thinking about future generations in the continuum of life. But the second thing to say is that the way that religion gets used in the public sphere, I don't think it's truly religious, because religion becomes hardened as a way of creating divisions or as a way of moving a platform around. But real religiousness involves a kind of attention to the meaning in front of you, whether it's a person you're talking to, something with which you vehemently disagree, or something that you have to do. It's not hardened And so, I mean, I think one has to distinguish between the use of religion, which is it's a false god or idol, and genuine religiousness. And I think genuine religiousness is a very powerful thing. Yeah.
Okay, let's go over here now.
Hi, my name is Drake. Earlier, David, you said something about a project that you were working on in Oberlin with involving a community and making this abstract idea more concrete in terms of a community. I'm sure a lot of individuals outside of Oberlin would love to be involved in projects like this. How would you suggest individuals going about making this abstract ideal more concrete, more personal, rather than just pertaining to a community that they may or may not live in?
Let me link that question with the previous question. There was a joke some of you may have heard about a little girl, actually it was a true story I'm told, who decided to draw a picture of God. And her mother said, well, honey, nobody knows what God looks like. And she says, well, they will now. And I think in some ways, back on your question, to take this word sustainability, it's the same kind of thing. What is it we are attempting to build? And so our intention in Oberlin is a joint enterprise of both city and the college. We're a little city of 10,000, the first college to accept African Americans and women and graduate them back in the 1830s and so forth. This is going to sound like an admissions pitch. It probably is.
Hey now.
But the attempt is to begin to flesh out this word sustainability that gives it, when you want to see what sustainability is, you go there. You see how food and downtown redevelopment and education and law and policy, these things hang together in a way that very much that David has described in terms of environment.
Of course,
we've
here
opened
in
an
Case
office
Western,
in-
we have the Fowler Center of Sustainability.
Yeah, and Roger Salat, maybe here, you already are embedded in this. This has become, the Cleveland metropolitan area, Northeast Ohio, has become a hotbed of some awfully important innovation in terms of sustainability. And the goal is to make this real. So the longer term goal here, long term, I mean in a year or two, is being to link up a network across the country and start our version of a grassroots movement, eventually trying to change the political dialogue at the very top. So we've got an office in Denver, we've opened an office in Washington, D.C. in cooperation with the New America Foundation. We have a board of directors, and we're trying to feel our way toward that network. But contact me afterwards, or just david.orr, oberlin.edu, and I'd be happy to pull you into the effort.
Will you repeat that email, please?
It's just david.orr@oberlin.edu.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for your question. Let's go now over to here.
Hi, my name is Zoe Economos from Montessori High School, and I just had a question relating to a personal story that I had. When I grew up in a town where there were radioactive materials located in a certain area, this generated a large portion of the people living in the certain area having cancer of various different types. I was closely related to some of them. I was wondering if you, we're so interconnected, the earth and us, because it not only harms the environment, but it harms ourselves to have this happen to us. How do you even justify that? I mean, how do you, I don't know, I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Go right ahead, Jeremy.
Well, I'm sorry you had to, it sounds like it was, there was real loss involved, and I'm sorry to hear that. If I understand your question right, it's that how can people put themselves in such a position that they, to use David's expression from a little while ago about the air, that they can just throw their garbage into the air that they breathe? Is this the thought? Yeah, so look, there are various different levels of explaining this, right? From thinking of humans as being short-sighted or errant or so on. But I think I agree with that most of us are saying that the main problem has to do with the political structure of the society you're in. And whether or not the citizens in the society we're in make our businesses and make our government be accountable to humanity. And not just to humanity, but to humanity, or I should say to humanity in a sense where we understand that humans are just part of a continuum of life. And I mean, ultimately, I think that that's the simple one-liner answer, that it's possible because citizenship has waned and because it's not empowered in the right way through knowledge, through educational systems, through a media that is genuinely helpful, and through business leaders who decide that over their dead body, they're going to let business interests get underneath the citizens. So that's where I would come at this issue.
I think that politics simply reflects how politicians act will reflect the underlying values of society. I've spent a lot of my life, when I was still an active scientist, lobbying every new minister of state for science and technology. They don't know anything. They come in, and then we have to educate them. They get up to a certain point, then they get moved out, and I start all over again. You know, we need, in order to deal with science and technology, we need a society that is scientifically literate.
Yeah, I agree.
And so I think that, you know, in terms of the ecological issues we're talking about now, politicians will simply reflect the values, and our values reflect the way that we treat the rest of the world. So we need to have a fundamental understanding again that we are animals. Mm-hmm. And as animals, it's our biological nature that dictates our most fundamental needs. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I gave a talk once at the first Green Building conference in Austin, Texas. Mm-hmm. And there were a number of children in the audience, and I said, now kids, if you remember one lesson from my talk today, please remember we are animals. Mm-hmm. Man, did their parents get pissed off at me. Don't call my daughter an animal. We're human beings, you know, like we, and you can see we think somehow we're different from the rest of life. If you call someone a snake or a worm or a rat or a pig or a chicken, these are all insults because we think that we're, you know, we haven't come to grips with our basic biological nature, which dictates our most fundamental needs. And that's got to be a societal thing. Politics is not going to be able to deal with that unless it's one of our basic cultural values. And we don't have that right now.
That's a good point.
Your question is a really good question, and the points you make behind the question is really good. And I agree with my colleagues on the platform. Ultimately, this comes down to a political system that can protect the least among us and future generations. And that is a political revolution that we have not yet experienced. Another Texan, Sanford Levinson, who's a constitutional lawyer, is proposing another constitutional convention in this country to deal with issues like this. But this eventually is a matter of power and politics. And one last comment is I worked for the last 5 or 6 years or longer with people in West Virginia where mountaintops are being cut off so we can get cheap coal. And of course, it means the coal is not cheap at all. It just means that the costs are never fully paid for the damage you've done. And they're suffering all kinds of illnesses and so forth. And I think the issue, in part, is also one that Nelson Mandela had to wrestle with in his memoirs. He's imprisoned in South Africa. And the wrongs were egregious. And yet he came out of that process without hatred and led the revolution then in South Africa. And I think there's a good bit of that attitude that we've got to build into this, because we've got some suffering and pain and some egregious wrongs that are going to go on before we fix this. But thanks very much for the points you've made.
Yes, thank you for sharing your personal story. We appreciate that. I'm going to come back over here.
William Carter. I'm emeritus professor at in environmental health and safety at the University of Findlay. In all due respect to our sponsors, I would like to ask the question, is capitalism, as currently emphasizing growth, antithetical to permaculture and sustainability?
Dr. Suzuki, would you care to comment on this?
Yes. The problem we face is that we've come to think we're so smart and so important that we're going to dictate the conditions of the biosphere. And, you know, I'm going to say this in my talk tonight, but we know that we live in a world that is shaped, that we have to live with by natural law, laws of nature. In physics, as David says, you know, we accept that there is a law of gravity. We accept there are limits on how fast a rocket can go. We accept that entropy is a reality, and chemistry determines the kind of chemical reactions and molecules you can create. I mean, we understand those are laws of nature. In biology, it's the same. Our biological nature dictates that we have an absolute need for clean air, clean water, clean soil, sunlight, and so on. So those we live with. Other things like capitalism, currency, markets, economics, corporations, these aren't forces of nature, for heaven's sakes. We invented them. So but what we try to do, if you look at Copenhagen, 192 nations 3 years ago met in Copenhagen to deal with the atmosphere that doesn't belong to anyone. But they had 192 national boundaries and 192 economic agendas that they negotiate, trying to squeeze or shoehorn nature into our agendas. Well, it can't work that way. We think we're so important, we can make the air conform to our country or our economic needs, but that's what we're trying to do.
David.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So far, you've agreed with everything that David said.
Yeah, we were told to be agreeable. Just stay away from controversy. You know, the issue here with capitalism is, in part, the laws of capitalism. If you start that with Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, that was 237 years ago. So the laws we take to be the laws of capitalism are 237 years old. The problem is they were trying to shoehorn those into a planet where it's evolved over 3.8 billion years. And that's kind of a tough assignment. And without getting into details, if I'm optimistic in part because of people like Ray Anderson, a friend of mine that died last year of cancer. But he started a company called Interface Carpet Corporation. And Ray decided that he wanted his supply chain to start with his customers, not Saudi Arabian crude. And then he wanted to give the customers a product that he would own, he would lease it, and then he would get it back and remake it into a new carpet, which meant he had to assemble the molecules in the way that he wanted. He could disassemble them and rearrange them and then give it back. So you cut off the supply, crude oil supply over here, and it never went to a landfill, where it otherwise would have stayed for 40,000 years. Gene Benyus, who will be here in several weeks, has developed a field called biomimicry. And you think of biomimicry, how, for example, she says spiders take dead flies and sunshine. And they make materials stronger than steel by 5 times, tougher than Kevlar, from which we make bulletproof vests, ambient temperature, no fossil fuels, made at or near the body, biodegradable, no heat, beat, treat, as she describes it, biomimicry. And nature does things, nature manufactures things, ceramics and so forth, much more intelligently than anything we can make. So there's a way here to begin to calibrate the way nature works with the way this human institution capitalism works. And then in the meantime, I think we have to figure out how to regulate capitalism for the good of the whole community. So no more deregulation of, let's say, the banking industry and collapsing the global economies we had in 2008. And that was because of the repeal of legislation passed in the New Deal that had regulated banks and kept them out of certain kinds of activity. So I don't think we have an alternative to capitalism. I think we have a choice of whether we have a good capitalism and begin to encourage innovation in the way we make things and the way we provide livelihood or not. And on that, I can be optimistic on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. I'm not, and Sunday I don't think about it. So.
Well, and Ray Anderson was successful with his sustainable carpet model.
Ray
it was
Anderson,
not as though he gave up on profits and so forth. This was a both and, correct?
Company, he decided he was going to make it so there was no waste product and to be powered by sunshine. And so he began to make a company that was sustainable in every way you could think of it at this point. And I think that there are other companies beginning to move in that direction, but it's a different kind of capitalism. That in the business world, you've got it at your business school here, the Weatherhead School, courses in triple bottom line. And you've got some of the leading thinkers and how you begin to shift corporations into this kind of mindset. And it turns out it's really weird. Because what appears to be just do-gooderism, actually it's pretty good for the bottom line. And so it's one of these ironic convergences of doing the right thing and doing the smart thing converge on the same kind of business enterprise.
Well, the weird thing about the current economic agenda, and I don't think it's inherent, it may be, I'm not an economist, but in capitalism, is this drive for constant growth. Which, what is growth? Why is growth suddenly an end in itself? This idea that if we don't, in my country, they're saying we got to dig up the tar sands because that's going to be the economic engine of Canada. We've got to keep the economy growing. But nobody asks, well, wait a minute, what's an economy for? Are there no limits? How much is enough? Are we happier with all of this growth? I mean, we are among the richest people on the planet. How much do we need? Why do we have to have more? Growth, when you live in a finite world, and our home is the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. Carl Sagan told us if you shrink the Earth to the size of a basketball, the biosphere will be thinner than a layer of saran wrap. And that's it, not just for us, but 30 million other species that share that space. And we think that we can grow our economy forever. Steady growth, let me take 1 minute. Steady growth is, constant growth is called exponential growth. And anything growing exponentially will double in a predictable time. So if it's growing at 1% a year, it'll double in 70 years. 2% a year in 35, 3%, 24. We can predict the growth. I'm going to give you a system. Art Bartlett, physicist at Colorado, gave this to me, that is going to grow exponentially. I'm going to give you a test tube full of food for bacteria. I'm going to put one bacterial cell in, and it's going to divide every minute. That's exponential growth. So at the beginning, there's one bacterium. 1 minute, there are 2. 2 minutes, there are 4. 3 minutes, 8. 4 minutes, 16. That's exponential growth. And at 60 minutes, the test tube is completely full of bacteria, and there's no food left. So it's a 60-minute. When is the test tube only half full? Well, of course, the answer is at 59 minutes. So let's suppose that, and at 58 minutes, it's 25% full. 57 minutes, 12.5% full. At 55 minutes of a 60-minute cycle, it's 3% full. So if at 55 minutes, one of the bacteria says, hey guys, we got a population problem. The other bacteria would say, what the hell, what have you been smoking? I mean, 97% of the test tube's empty, and we've been around for 55 minutes. So at 59 minutes, they decide, hey, we got to do something. Jack was right. We got 1 minute left. So what do? We need a mega project. And guess what? Those bacterial scientists invent 3 test tubes full of food. So they're saved, right? They quadruple the amount of food in space. So at 60 minutes, the first test tube's full. 61 minutes, the second's full. 62 minutes, if we found 3 more planets to live on immediately, it would only buy us 2 extra minutes. So, and every scientist I've talked to agrees with me, we're already past the 59th minute. And so and people say, how dare you say that? Look at our stores. We're living longer and healthier. Yeah, we've created the illusion that everything's fine by using up the rightful legacy of our children and our grandchildren. That's how we're doing it.
I apologize for this, but I need to make a practical announcement. There are some Case Western students who may have to step out at this moment because they have classes, and I just want to give them one moment to do so discreetly, and we appreciate them coming and attending for as long as they could, but we need them to continue their education, and so we will let them step out for one moment. Jeremy, did you want to comment on this? David Orr, yes.
Let me get this straight. You went to Texas and said they were animals. You came here and compared us to bacteria. one thought that comes to mind, it fits Case Western. You've got some amazing capabilities here. David Cooperrider has been leading, the leading scholar in something called appreciative inquiry. And as David Suzuki is talking, it strikes me that we need a national dialogue about kind of tough stuff. And we need to get to the bottom of a lot of things very quickly. And Case has been a leader in that field. And I just want to point that out. There's a dialogue here that needs to be managed, and there's some rules to carry out those kind of dialogues. So just a thought.
I do want to say one thing. I mean, growth is growth of an abstraction. I just think that's important to say, because I have a colleague in Colorado who works on this problem philosophically, and I always think he's making this mistake. It doesn't necessarily mean growth of things, but physical things. It means growth of value. Value can be intensified if it's regulated properly, right? So this is what costs are supposed to reflect. But the problem is, and I appreciate hearing stories of businesses that are starting to turn the corner on this issue. But the issue, frankly, is macroeconomic. It's not, the great business that does it, that's great, perhaps it'll catch on, but it's not going to do anything if the incentives in the system say, free ride and push it off onto the future. If the incentives say, I don't have to pay anything for taking away what the future deserves. So, I agree with the general gist of it, but I wouldn't get too hung up on this growth thing. The issue is, are we regulating the economy properly, which is what David Orr was saying. And we need to internalize externalities. We need to have, look, every economy, no matter how libertarian you are, has regulation for contract. We've decided it's not okay to sell human beings. These things can be done. We need the right kind of legal instruments to frame in the generation of wealth, so that when wealth comes out and is registered as growth, it's quality. It's a quality that we can live with and hold up to ourselves in the morning as human beings and say, you know what, this is all right. So, I wouldn't emphasize too much the issue about growth, but rather the issue that it's a macroeconomic mess that we've let get out of our hands. And that's a citizenship issue. That's what I'm trying to say with the politics. Yeah.
First of all, I want to just extend thanks to those of you who are waiting for the questions and standing there. But how can I interrupt this conversation? But you, sir, are next.
My name's Peter Hart. I'm a biologist here at Case Western. I was at the first Earth Day in 1970 when I was a sophomore in college. And I want to thank you all for making one of the most stimulating discussions that I've heard since then. I think we need a lot more of this. We all try to think over the course of our lives how we can best invest our time in these issues. And we're going back and forth about a lot of different issues. We all do recycling because it maybe reaffirms our daily commitment, even though we may feel like it's a drop in the bucket. But I think certainly in my life, I've tried to think about what are the most significant actors on the planet for the problems that we have. And if I might perhaps revisit the comment of my friend from Finland without raising the whole issue about capitalism per se, I'd just like to hear your comments on the implications of what I think are the most significant actors, and that is the emergence of certain multinational corporations, and particularly, for example, those proposing extracting oil from tar sands, the current frenzy in the United States over using new fracking technology to extract natural gas. We're seeing a real boom of that around here. I can't help but think that these corporations, who have, despite the opinion of our Supreme Court that they're individuals, have largely outflanked the ability of governments. We like to talk theoretically about ourselves as citizens and individuals, but in fact they're actors that are much larger than us, who have successfully and persistently pursued the ability to outflank nation states, governments, making it increasingly difficult to be optimistic about our political impact on these issues. and making us increasingly discouraged about where do we act, in what arena do we act in order to deal with these problems. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. Who would like to go first?
Corporations are nowhere mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. So for people who like to talk about original intent, corporations do not appear in that document. Second thing, both Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln worried a great deal about corporations. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln assumed that, just from what he'd seen in the Civil War and the corporations supplying guns and blankets to the Union armies, that the corporations would eventually amass all the power and the republic would be destroyed. And that was 1864, and he was a Republican. The issue in 1886 was that the Supreme Court was said to have given the legal rights of a person to corporations. In fact, the case shows that they didn't really do that. That was a misreading of what are called the head notes to that decision. But it's a moot point because corporations have been assumed to have the same protections of due process that people have by the 14th Amendment. Now, you and I are people. We are mortal. We can be in one place at one time. Our assets are limited. We die. We are ethical people in between, if you know. But corporation stands oddly against this backdrop of democracy, and we don't know quite what to do with them. And that's going to be one of the huge issues. Are corporations persons, legal persons? You and I are legal persons. Are corporations entitled to the same rights as you and I have? That's going to be one big issue. Mitt Romney has raised it several months ago, and an issue has been kind of inflammatory, but this is going to be a tough issue. How do we provision ourselves with all the things that we need? And corporations stand astride international politics in many ways beyond the reach of law in any given country. And so it is an issue, and I don't propose a solution for it. It's going to be a very tough political issue. They have corrupted, I think, American politics in some very fundamental ways and so forth. But you know the story as well or better than I do. And so that, thanks for raising the issue. But I can't think of anything politically that would be more important than beginning to reorient corporate behavior to long-term public purposes, and rather like corporations were at the start of this country at the writing of the Constitutions in 1787. It's just, it is a tough issue because it's so legally embedded, and it's going to be hard to disentangle all the issues and come to an equitable, fair solution that coincides with a decent long-term future.
You know, I have been letting all of the panelists comment on each question, but I see the rows stacked up on each side. So I actually would like to see if we can fit in a few more questions before we run out of time here.
Shannon,
so
can I just make a,
oh, of course,
a
yes,
partly
please. Yes.
tongue-in-cheek, but it would help or be a big beginning if all corporate leaders would read Mr. Inamori's books.
Yes, we agree with that here at Case Western Reserve, and. For any of you who are not familiar, the Kyocera motto is respect the divine and love people. How's that for a corporate motto? Now, I'd like to take this question, please.
Hi, I'm Lee Batdorf from Cleveland Heights. This is for David Suzuki, but you're all welcome to speak to it unless she stops you.
Which I might.
My question is about how we're going to find our way. As any environmental activist knows, it's a complicated thing to deal with environmental issues and talking with the public about it. And in the last decade, I've noticed schisms developing in what you could call the environmental movement. And I've noticed that Stuart Brand of Whole Earth fame has come out for nuclear power, among other technologies. And then I've read in a recent issue of Wired magazine about how not only is renewable energy not going to do the job, but nuclear, of course, is very expensive to do, and the solution isn't fracked natural gas. And where do we go to find a coherent direction to pursue as individuals to make decisions of how to treat the environment in a way that 7 generations from now there might be something left.
Thank you. And I think to continue, as I was suggesting, David Suzuki, if you could reply, and then we'll take another question. We'll take one reply to each response to try to get a few more folks in.
Well, I wish I knew the answer. I think what we need is diversity of thought within the movement. And certainly a lot of my colleagues are now looking to nukes as the answer. It doesn't make any sense. It makes no economic sense to me. And we have major problems with the technology, even when it's in place. And Fukushima ought to be a big reminder of that. So we have to constantly be listening and open to the issues in environmentalism. Nobody has absolute truth. But I think the most important issue is, how do we stay in the game? We have to have sustainable activism. And so many of my colleagues have just burned out, flamed out, got involved in an issue and flamed out. And I hate to say it, but a number of them have committed suicide, because it is very serious. We need to have sustainable activism as well. For me, the greatest gift that I received was one day, I was leaving my family, I was in the office working and saying, I gotta do this, I gotta finish it tonight. And one day I looked in the mirror and said, who the hell do you think you are? You're one person out of 6.5 million people, 7 billion now, I'm sorry. You're one person. You think you're so important you're going to make a difference? You just are one human being, and you do the best you can and hope that there are enough people to add together so that collectively we will have an impact. Don't flame out is the important thing.
I've just been cautioned that we have time for 2 more questions. So over here, please. And apologies to those of you who've been waiting so patiently, and I hope perhaps you could join us for some of our other events. Yes.
My name is Eric Schreiber. I am on the staff of the Cleveland Clinic, and you've almost answered the question with your great discussion about growth, Dr. Suzuki. I wish you could amplify on one thing. Dr. Bartlett also mentioned in his talking on this the oxymoron of sustainable growth. We've heard from both conventions, as was pointed out, growth, economic models are based on growth. What's this going to look like? Any mathematician will tell you that all growth stops. What do you think the prognosis is for making a transition from economic models based on growth to different economic models that are not? Thank you.
I'm not a futurist, I don't know. But I think if you look at Clive Hawking, who's an eco-philosopher from Australia, his book Requiem for a Species, we're the species the Requiem is for. And what he does is he simply traces what we've been talking about over the last 40 years and what's actually been done politically, and it's pretty depressing. And the reality is we work as hard as we can in whatever areas, but I think it's going to take a crisis of monumental proportions. I thought when 30,000 people died in Europe of heat one summer, I thought that's it. I remember there was once 600 or 700 people died in Chicago of heat. I thought Katrina might be it. But it looks like there's going to have to be a crisis of mass. I thought 2008 economic meltdown might be it. But we're not going to do it just the way we're doing now. There's going to have to be something helping us out, and that's going to be a tragedy of monumental proportions.
I'm just real short. I've been trying to hold over the past questions, so I'll be short. I mean, again, I'm a gradualist about these things. I don't think you get the solution like this. You get bridge concepts to start hinging it towards something different. So again, growth is just as an abstraction. I would suggest a phrase something like intensification of value as a hinge concept. And the real issue then is not the semantics of it, although maybe the semantics help. The issue is the macroeconomic system regulated properly in a way that is in line with justice? in the way that we no longer sell human beings because it's unjust to sell human beings. It's unjust to sell the future. It's unjust to externalize our costs on the future. So the issue, I mean, you can change the language and talk about intensification of value, but the core issue is about the macroeconomic frame. And so then just to the last question, again, in practical judgment, the issue is not always what's going to keep it going forever or what's going to solve the whole problem, but what's the first most important thing? And then if we can get that thing in place, maybe we can see how the terrain looks different after it. So I do think there's one very simple important thing. The United States has to have a serious role in signing up for a binding global climate treaties post-Kyoto. It's a complete travesty that we have inhibited climate regulation. But if we could get behind climate regulation, China would have to start taking it more seriously. India would have to start taking it more seriously. And most importantly, there would be a legal frame to start modeling for other sorts of ecological regulations that can only happen at the global level. So I think, you know, if I'm as an environmentalist, it's if you got to recycle to keep your integrity going and to imagine a different lifestyle, go for it. But the main number one thing is getting a global compact that has some enforceable power and that the United States and other major polluters are behind. And as citizens, we need to say to every single one of our representatives, why aren't you talking about this? So I think that's the thing. That starts the macroeconomic frame, and then you can start thinking about what the system would look like differently.
And and please, if you could state your name.
Hi, I'm Hope Gerald from Shaker Heights High School, where I'm a junior and a candidate of the IB International Bachelorette Program. I had a question constructed for Jeremy, like no favoritism involved. But earlier you mentioned we have evolved into a near-term, we've evolved into near-term thinkers as a society. But what specific factors, examples, areas of knowledge, or even ways of knowing do you have to back up your knowledge claim?
Okay. That's a great critical comment. You know what, there's a book. There's a book by a guy named Matthew Ridley called The Origins of Virtue. And it gives you the anthropological evidence on to the extent to which we are near term and to the extent to which we can counteract it. But I want to turn it over to my colleagues because they made some claims about how our economy now has made us short term. And maybe they can fill that out a little bit.
Well, very briefly, if you will, gentlemen.
Yeah.
One comment very quickly, going back to the last point. If you were to go back to, say, the year 1750 in Western society and say, let's go out and watch the Enlightenment happening. Remember your history? Where would you go? I mean, the Enlightenment was a letter from Montesquieu to Diderot and Thomas Jefferson in a hotel room in Philadelphia and so forth. There was no place you could go to see it. And if you run the film forward, say 200 years and look back at our time, I think there's something like an ecological enlightenment beginning to emerge. You all are here because of it. A lot of the activity in Cleveland and Case and Oberlin and all over the world now is part of a global enlightenment. And it is possible, it is just possible that we're farther along in this process than we think or that we could be able to see from right now. In the same way that nobody in 1750 could have foreseen Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence and so forth and so on. It's hard to see good things unfolding when you're right in the middle of it. But this prize and the work of all of you in the room and my colleagues and so forth may be an indication that we could be, just perhaps, maybe, possibly, farther along than it otherwise would look. Maybe.
May I give you the last word?
No, that's fine for me.
Well, I want to thank you all for a wonderful discussion. I think everyone in the room is saying, don't make them stop, but it is my job to make it stop. But this is not the end of our events. I'm very sorry that we could not get to all of your questions, but I hope you will continue your engagement with us. As soon as we conclude here, our panelists will be walking over to our first ever Eco Showcase at the Kelvin Smith Library Oval, where they will be selling and signing copies of some of their more recent books. And the Eco Showcase is a wonderful opportunity for you to network and learn about environmental and sustainability work in our region. I also invite you all to join us this evening back right here in Severance Hall at 6 p.m. for the 2012 Inamori Ethics Prize ceremony, when we will actually put the medal around your neck, Dr. Suzuki, and we will hear David Suzuki's lecture, The Challenge of the 21st Century, Setting the Real Bottom Line. Now, if you will, please join me in thanking our panelists for an amazing discussion. On behalf of President Snyder and Provost Baselek, I declare this academic symposium closed, and I thank you all for joining us.